Hello, welcome to this Ned Davis research video where we will help you see the signals. My name is Brian Sanborn, NDR's Global Head of Investment Solutions. In this episode, we will be speaking with NDR's Chief Economist, Alejandra Grindal. In her latest global economic research note, Alejandra noted strong divergences within the global economy. In particular, she found growing risk within China and Europe, but a more optimistic outlook in Japan, the US, and India. Alejandra, you mentioned the dreaded R word for Europe, recession. What is causing you to take a cautious tone on the region?
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me on today's video. So the R word, definitely not something you want to hear for your economy. But if you look at the drivers in Europe, they're seeing a continuation of high inflation, much tighter monetary policy, especially compared to last year. And very specific to Europe is they are feeling larger consequences from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So all these together have just taken a toll on the economy. At NDR, as you know, we believe in the weight of the evidence. We look at numerous indicators to make a particular call. And so in that spirit, we have our recession watch report for Europe. And confirming a lot of these negative views, the number of our recession watch indicators that are at their critical level moved up to 5 in June and have remained there in July. And so ultimately that tells us that there is renewed risk of recession. We now have a majority that are at that recessionary threshold. Now, one thing I do want to point out about the Eurozone is that their potential growth, so this is their best possible sustained GDP growth in the long term, it's actually quite low. So it really doesn't take a whole lot to put the Eurozone economy into negative territory, or at least to see some sort of downside. But to give you an example of some of the indicators in our watch report, one is the composite PMI. So for the month of August, and this is a pretty timely read on the economy, the composite PMI for the Eurozone fell to 46.7. It's the third straight month it's been in contraction territory and actually the lowest level in almost 3 years. And according to our recession watch report, the composite PMI triggers a recession signal when it falls below 50. Now, the services PMI, and this is actually what's concerning, this is the households, the stronghold of the economy. It actually slipped into negative territory in August for the first time this year. And manufacturing, which has been sort of lagging anyway, continued to contract at a rapid pace. Another indicator that we watch closely is our in-house Eurozone recession probability model. And it is now indicating a moderate risk of recession according to its latest reading for September. And the risk has been rising in recent months. So this is confirming a lot of the deterioration that we're seeing in other data.
Alejandra, what implications would recession have for European equity markets?
That's, again, a really great question because this is what investors need to know. This is what's important. So historically, our analysis has found that when the European economy has been in recession, or even if its economy has been underperforming other large economies. So Brian, in your intro, you mentioned that, other parts around the world are sort of holding up okay relative to this rising recession risk in Europe. So historically, we have found that these conditions have been associated with relatively weaker equity market performance in Europe.
And unfortunately for European investors, we're seeing confirmation of the gloomy outlook for Europe in our non-US equity allocation model. The model currently has large underweight allocations to European markets such as France and Switzerland. Moving to Asia Pacific, China started off the year very strong after ending its zero COVID policy. What's happened since then?
Yeah, so not so many good things. So as you mentioned, Brian, China ended its zero COVID policy. And at the beginning of this year, we saw a huge surge in Chinese consumer activity. We saw retail sales jump. We saw services activity surge. But if you look at a lot of the recent data, this consumption growth has fizzled out as this pent-up demand or, this revenge spending, as many call it, was satisfied very quickly. Now, this was actually in line with our expectations. If you look at Chinese households, they did not see the same amount of pandemic-related stimulus that the developed world saw. So we didn't expect as much of a surge in consumption activity. And then our other concern was that so many years of this zero COVID policy may have actually damaged consumer confidence in the long term. So consumers in general are more prone to be cautious. But it's not just the consumer side. If you look at overseas demand for Chinese exports, they're not doing that great either. In fact, exports plunged over 14% in July from a year earlier. And this was the largest decline since 2009 if you exclude Lunar New Year distortions. And part of this is just due to waning goods demand. Most countries around the world have moved back to demanding services, but it's also due to this reconfiguration of supply chains, which has been due to these rising tensions between China and the West. And very similar to this analysis that I talked about with respect to Europe, a weakening Chinese economy. So whenever we're just seeing momentum slow, it does have negative implications for Chinese equities.
And given the weaker economic outlook for China, does that mean that China's government will significantly stimulate the economy?
So the government has and will continue to provide stimulus. But I think a lot of people were expecting this mega stimulus package, but we just think it'll be enough stimulus for the government to achieve its 5% growth goal, or at least come close to it. And I think their concern is they don't want to stoke excesses and bubbles in certain sectors like real estate, because some fiscal packages in the past have actually done that. And, government learned the consequences from that. And they just don't have an appetite to overstimulate. Also, China has incredibly high debt, especially for emerging market standards, but also, compared to a lot of large developed markets. And then you add in the fact that China has extremely weak demographics. So this suggests that a lot of the stimulus just may not be as effective as it was in the past. So sort of our bottom line with Chinese stimulus is it'll be at best enough to stabilize the cycle, but not really ignite it.
So we've covered a number of areas with greater risks. Where are you seeing a bright spot in the global economy?
I would say one bright spot that stands out to me, and actually has for quite some time, really on both an absolute and relative economic basis, is India. So just looking at data, I like to look at the PMIs. And if you look at the latest composite PMI for India, it is very high. It's indicating very robust growth. And it's actually one of the highest readings that we're seeing all over the world. Like many other economies, including the United States, the services sector in India is growing pretty quickly. But sort of what stands out is that manufacturing is doing quite well. And this is contrary to a lot of trends that we're seeing in other parts of the world. Now, with any economy, especially with some of these downside risks we're seeing from China and Europe, on an absolute basis, India's economy does face some headwinds. So we can't ignore them. Interest rates are high because, keep in mind the central bank, like many other central banks around the world, engaged in an aggressive tightening cycle. Global growth is slowing. It's not quite as strong as it was at the beginning of this year. Higher oil prices pose a risk to a lot of economies, but in India, because they are energy dependent, this sort of increases the risk of its current account deficit widening. And then there were a few, like many economies, they sort of had some adverse weather conditions. They had summer flash floods, which interrupted growth over the summer, caused a spike in inflation. So we could see some, weaker economic momentum. But on balance, I would say if you look at India in both the intermediate term and long term, it remains pretty constructive. Government support, for example, has been geared toward the electronics sector. So that's one of the reasons why we've seen the manufacturing sector hold up. As a result, and somewhat related to this, a lot of measures of business confidence remain elevated. Bank loan growth has also picked up at its fastest rate in over a decade. So those are just good intermediate term leading indicators. And then if you look at the longer term, and this is something we've discussed quite a bit at NDR for quite some time because we do a lot of work on demographics, is India stands to benefit from a young and very large population. So they have this pipeline of available workforce over the next few decades. And then this trend of deglobalization from China, which I discussed earlier, could also benefit India.
Alejandra, with regards to India, NDR's non-US equity allocation model looks at both core markets and explore markets, while it overweights and underweights some of the larger markets like China and European markets. It does select a handful of smaller markets based upon market capitalization, India being one of them. And over the last couple of months, India has been one of the higher ranked markets in that particular model. So we've discussed a number of divergences within the global economy today, but are you seeing any common themes cutting across the global economy which will impact the financial markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest story of the past couple of years has been inflation, right? So, on one hand, inflation is not nearly as strong as it was around this time last year. We're seeing that momentum ease. However, core pressures do remain elevated, especially among services prices. And so ultimately, the key theme we're seeing among many developed market central banks is they're unlikely to pivot to easing monetary policy in the near term.
Alejandra, thank you so much for your insights. NDR clients can read Alejandra's work in her weekly Global Economic Focus publication. Also, many of Alejandra's indicators are used within NDR model portfolios available on platforms like Amplify, as well as available for direct delivery too. Finally, a lot of Alejandra's work is also incorporated into the smart sector models, which are available via ETFs through Hagen Asset Management. For more information on how to access NDR's work, whether it's through the written research or through our model portfolios, please visit the following websites. Alejandra's work is available on NDR's macro research content, and then our model portfolios, again, are available via direct delivery on platforms and also through ETF issuers. Thank you so much for your time. We hope we helped you to see the signals. So long.